And why? Hello?
Hi, Barbara.
I'm here.
Hi, I'm from Seattle, Maggie Pheasant from Wider Horizons.
This is Jen from Northwest Montana, by Glacier Village.
Hi, everyone. We'll get started shortly. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay.
David
This
and I
is-
from Los Angeles.
This is Carrie Sheets from Slow Village in San Luis Obispo. Oh, I'm sorry.
Maureen Shostak from Village of the Coastside in California.
Bill
This is
Gray
Carrie.
from Baltimore.
This is Carrie Sheets from San Luis Obispo, California, Slow Village.
Hi, this is Lorna Bellman from High Village, LA.
Paul Felice here from York, Pennsylvania.
This is Harriet Michigan, Penn's Village in Philadelphia.
Carol Stein from the Village, Chicago.
Nikki Fox from the Village, Chicago.
Carol Gray from Clayton Valley Village.
Deborah Flaherty from Villages of San Mateo County in California.
This is Howard Shapiro from Villages of the Berkshires in Western Massachusetts.
This is Linda Spink from Pelham with Amherst Neighbors in Massachusetts.
This is Randy Kutnewski, Villages of San Mateo County in California.
Judith Geffner, The Village, Chicago.
Connie Robb, Silver Spring Village in outside of DC.
Kathy Ricky, Washington, Waterfront Village, Washington, DC.
Hi, this is Bob Anderson from Wider Horizons in Seattle.
Susan Davis from actually Santa Monica right now and Alexandria, Virginia usually.
Richard Morton from Wake Barcroft Village in Northern Virginia.
Lisa Roman, stay at home in Wilton, Connecticut.
Fran Whelan from Palos Verdes Peninsula Village in Southern California.
Janet Farr, Village Without Walls in Hillsboro, Oregon.
Kathy Schatzberg from Barnstable Neighbor to Neighbor, a village in development in Cape Cod, Massachusetts.
Ann Gormley from Northwest Villages in Portland, Oregon.
Patty Slagle from Coastline Neighbors in Southern Oregon.
Hi, I'm Teresa Williams from Cheverly, Maryland, Cheverly Village, in DC.
Amy Baker from Delaware Village.
I'm Maureen Markham from Arlington Neighborhood Village in Arlington, Virginia.
Hi, I'm Kathy Lieblich from Neighbors Network in Orlando, Florida.
I'm Judy Macias from Village of the Coastside, California.
Toddy Gelbspan, JP at Home, Boston, Massachusetts.
Michelle Getz-Grales, share care of Leelanau County, Michigan.
Pam Bradshaw, share care, Leelanau County, Michigan.
Jim Sanders in the Village in Howard County, Maryland.
Cindy Bach, Queen Anne's County, and at home.
Marianne Probst, Palos Verdes Peninsula Village, and
Hi, this is Mark.
Hey, Mark. Welcome.
Thank you. I had trouble getting in.
So did I.
sorry.
I was freaking out.
Oh yeah, same here. I'm still sweating.
You have no idea. I got my laptop out as a backup. Well, welcome, Mark. I'm going to say a few words and then I'm going to turn it over to Mark. So, good afternoon. While we were passing the time, Mark, all our villages from around the country, right now we're at 100, but we have over about 300 that's going to be jumping on. But we ask everybody to mute their things except for Mark, their computers. And I invite our villages. We have a couple of people who had sent in questions ahead of time, but we are asking our network villages, if you want to ask a question, go into the chat room. We'll try to get to you as soon after Mark finishes. So anyway, without further ado, Marc Freedman, we are so pleased to have you. I don't have to tell you an entree, but I will. So Mark is the CEO and the president of Encore.org and is one of the nation's leading experts on longevity revolution. He is the originator of the Encore Career Idea Thinking Second Acts to a Greater Good. He also spearheaded the creation of the Encore Fellowships program, a one-year fellowship helping individuals translate their midlife skills into second acts focused on social impact. A graduate of Swarthmore, yay, PA, and yeah, had to get that plug, and holds an MBA from Yale. Thank you for joining us, Mark. A sort of encore presentation, no pun intended, of your speech in Chicago last year. Those who couldn't attend the Chicago conference, I invited Mark to come and just give us an uplifting. We all need a positive word and encouragement in what we're doing throughout the country. And this is a great example of the presentation here, of everybody here and saying hi and connecting. So thank you and welcome.
Thanks so much, Barbara. And I'm so grateful to be able to do this. And I'm actually asking your forbearance from the beginning. I didn't want to give the talk that I gave in Chicago, or really even give anything that's in the realm of a speech, given everything that's going on. I mostly wanted to throw out one particular idea that's been rattling around in my mind, and that I feel has a potential connection to the village to village movement, and to mostly have a conversation in the hour that we have today. But I thought I'd start out and maybe just talk for 20 minutes to provide some perspective. But again, in the mea culpa vein, this is not something that's worked out and something that's you know, that I want to say to you so much as something that I want to ask you about. And I think I'll just start by going back to the talk in Chicago last year, which was really about the perils of age segregation in American society, and how we decided to organize society so starkly by age, what we gained from that, but also some of the real losses. So today's comments relate to that, and I thought I'd even start, I think when I gave the Chicago speech, I started out with a story of driving over the Bay Bridge. I live in Berkeley into San Francisco, and for many months, getting stuck in traffic, it seemed invariably in front of a billboard from Prudential, which announced that the first person to live to 150 had already been born. And it was not a celebration of long lives, because the second line right after was better prepare for a longer retirement. And in fact, I'm sure that there was no celebratory intent, because it's now been replaced by another Prudential billboard, which says, a robot can't take your job if you've already been retired. So, but it made me think. I was driving to Silicon Valley because I did a fellowship at the Longevity Center at Stanford, and Silicon Valley at that point and still was not content with 150-year lives. Even there, with billions of dollars being spent then to this day in radical life extension to 500, even beyond. Larry Ellison, the founder of Oracle, has proclaimed that he's out to conquer death entirely, saying that he was contemptuous of death. He never thought much of it, to which Michael Kinsley, the founding editor of Slate, said, it doesn't matter so much what Larry Ellison thinks of death as what death thinks of Larry Ellison. So there was some comfort in that. But the speech that kept running through my head when I would see those billboards was actually one from JFK in 1963, which was his most important speech on aging, and it came just 6 months before his assassination. And there's been so much attention in 2019 to JFK's moonshot prediction of getting to the moon before the end of the decade, and everybody's heard a lot about, of course, his ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country, that he delivered at the University of Michigan to a generation of young boomers. But this speech is forgotten, but its most memorable line is one in which he said, "We've added years to life. Now it's time to add life to those years." And since JFK delivered that speech in 1963, we've added 2 months on average to the American lifespan each year. So we've been very good on the adding years to life part still, but when it comes to the life to years part, what's the purpose of all of these additional years, now decades, that we've added to the American lifespan? That's been a much more troubling process. And I think about it very much today as we're in the midst of this pandemic, and we're being told rightly to stay home and stay safe. I'm certainly doing that. There's much wisdom to taking care of ourselves at this time. I've got diabetes, and I'm 62 years old, and so I'm very much aware of that. But what disturbs me in this message is that there's an underlying one, which is essentially, and stay out of the way. Stay home, stay safe, and stay out of the way. You're an object of service, which is certainly needed, and young people and others are bringing us meals and doing all that. But what about all the progress that we've been struggling to make about what we can do for society? And I feel like there's been a real spike in views of the contribution of older people as being something that's superfluous. And so without in any way dismissing the need for care and caution at this point, I want to channel another image that we're seeing out there that runs very much against the grain of the stay home, stay safe, and stay out of the way idea, which is Dr. Fauci, who will turn 80 in December, and all of the older doctors and nurses who've come forward and put themselves in harm's way, oftentimes coming out of retirement to help out. And again, I'm not saying that that's for everybody to do, but it's a reminder of how essential older people are, how much we have to contribute. I think back to Maggie Kuhn, the founder of the Gray Panthers, who said many wise things. She was a real rabble rouser. She's buried in my native Philadelphia, as Barbara was calling out our Pennsylvania ties, under a gravestone that says, "Here lies Maggie Kuhn under the only stone she left unturned." And I want to turn over this stay out of the way stone right now, because there's something else that Maggie Kuhn said, which is that we don't have a single person to waste. And I think we're realizing how much we need each other and how much we need the contribution of all segments of society right now. And I think there's no place where that contribution is more needed than for young people in America today. Again, there are these very powerful examples of the doctors and nurses and Dr. Fauci in the health realm. But 5 years ago, Robert Putnam, the Harvard political scientist, wrote a book, Bowling Alone. And in it, he said that the American dream was being lost through the prospects of children today, which are more dismal, he argued, than ever over the past century. And he could have anticipated what this pandemic is doing to young people in America today. We all have stories of friends and relatives whose graduations are being eliminated and aren't having important rights in life, but also what's happening with school. There's now a phrase, Generation C, for Generation COVID, and we're hearing about the COVID slide of learning losses that young people are experiencing, a spike in abuse of children at home. I could go on and describe the fate of young people, and I'm absolutely convinced that those of us in our 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and beyond can play an incredibly important role in helping these young people and benefit tremendously ourselves. When I talked in Chicago, I talked about the research that's accumulated about how much young people need attention, care, love, and support from older people. One of my favorite child development scholars, a guy by the name of Yuri Bronfenbrenner, who's since passed, but he was a professor at Cornell and he co-founded the Head Start program, was once asked at the end of his life what he had learned from writing dozens of books and hundreds of articles. And he said, what every child needs is at least one adult who's irrationally crazy about them. And what I've discovered as I've gotten older myself and continued to read research on development at the other side of the age span is that we need to be irrationally crazy about young people. Laura Carstensen at Stanford, who's done a lot of research on well-being in later life, has found that as our sense of years left to live becomes shorter than years behind us, and that time becomes more compressed, our attention turns to relationship and connection, and that the skills that are needed for relationship and connection also blossom as we get older, emotional regulation, empathy. But there's a direction to all that connection. The Harvard study of adult development has shown that older people who connect with, mentor, support young people are 3 times as likely to be happy as older people who fail to do so. That's a study that's almost 75 years old. It's the gold standard of research on happiness and well-being in later life. And the picture that comes out from the research on young people, the research on older people, is that the needs and assets of the generations fit together like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. Even at a time when we hear okay boomer and okay millennial and all of these, supposed generational conflicts, the interdependence between older and younger people is enormous. And I think we need each other more than ever. I talked about young people and what they need, but at this time, you know, we're so much more aware of loneliness, and the two loneliest groups in society are, even before the crisis, were older people and younger people. But I think the close cousin is purposelessness, which is equally damaging to our health and well-being as we grow older. And I saw firsthand, I spent the first 10 years of my work in this area helping to create a program called Experience Corps, which is now run by AARP, which is in 24 cities around the country, and has shown a tremendous impact on young people being able to read by the 3rd grade. But what I was really struck by is the impact equally on older people. I was thinking this morning about a story from my native Philadelphia, from the Experience Corps in Philadelphia. And I remember talking to one of the members of the Experience Corps team at the Taylor Elementary School, a woman named Martha Jones. And on the team at Taylor Elementary School, there was Big Martha and Little Martha, and Martha Jones was Little Martha. And she told me one day about a February morning where it was cold and gray and miserable outside, and she was feeling blue and decided that she was going to skip going to the Taylor School that day, skip her work at Experience Corps, and just essentially call in sick, pull the covers over herself. And that was her plan, but she kept thinking about the kids and how disappointed they would be. And so she got dressed and went downstairs and took the bus and went to the Taylor School. It's an old 1920s building, and climbed up to the 2nd floor classroom where she was serving. And as she was hanging up her coat, she described feeling these 2 little arms crawling up behind her and thinking to herself, somebody loves me. And I think, you know, Freud said the keys to life were love and work. And I think the keys to later life are love, social connection, and work, a reason to get up in the morning, and a sense of purpose. And so I feel like rallying around young people today is a chance to have that sense of purpose, to find connection, and to do something else, which I think is an essential part of well-being in later life, which is what Erik Erikson, the great psychologist, called generativity. And he said the hallmark of happiness and well-being in later life could be encapsulated in the phrase, I am what survives of me. So I feel like this is a time, and this is kind of the idea that I wanted to throw out to you, even as we're staying home and staying safe, to do anything but stay out of the way. I feel like we need, first of all, to call older people to purpose, connection, and action. And I picked up the New York Times today, and David Brooks had a column calling young people to national service. And recently, Bill and Melinda Gates, last Saturday in the Wall Street Journal, as part of a whole set of virtual commencement addresses to the graduates of 2020, also talked about how young people had an opportunity and a responsibility to create a better world. But I wish the David Brookses of the world, who just wrote a book this past year, The Second Mountain, about well-being and contribution in later life. I wish Bill and Melinda Gates, who are extraordinary examples of people in their 60s focused on creating and living a better legacy, would actually turn to all of us, turn to their peers and say, you have an essential role to play. We have an essential role to play, and to call us all to action. So I feel like that message is missing. And in fact, the idea of national service for older people is extraordinarily compelling one. About 25 years ago, the Ford Foundation asked Richard Danzig, a former Secretary of the Navy, and Peter Zanton, a professor at Harvard's Kennedy School, to look at the idea of national service in general. And it was focused on young people, and they came back and said that older people had more to give and more to gain through national service than any other group. And I think what we need is a vast national mobilization of older people for young people, starting with helping kids read by the 3rd grade, but eventually involving work in preschool situations, helping young people transition to college and to work. And I think we need to start with a virtual effort, and there are some examples out there of how we could actually do that. I just read about one that was created recently called Eldera, which is an online platform helping older people to read to and connect with young ones in a virtual setting. And then I think eventually we need to move from virtual contribution to face-to-face work and a kind of hybrid of both of those things. And so I feel like if crisis is the mother of invention, I think that this crisis can be the grandmother of invention in helping us not just look to the talents of the older population and what they can contribute to society and to younger people, but to mobilize around creating better vehicles for us to use our time, talent, experience, generativity in ways that live an important legacy. And I guess I would go back to that JFK speech for inspiration to do it. So this is 1963. That's, I believe, it's 57 years ago. JFK went on from his comment about adding life to years, not just years to life, by laying out a plan for a vast national mobilization of older people, particularly to help younger generations. And it's ironic, I mean, his Ask Not call to the young boomers was issued a few years before that. And then in this speech not long before his own death, he essentially issued a call to action that for boomers' future selves, arguing that older people didn't want to go to the seashore. They wanted to live lives of continued meaning and purpose. And so I'd like to see us fulfill that vision, and not just to ask not as a generation again, but to ask now when it's more needed than ever. And I feel like the village to village movement, the spirit of connection and service that is so central to everything you all are doing, could play a leading role in this call to action and this call to innovation, so that we can contribute in ways that are personally meaningful, but that mean something beyond ourselves now into the future. And I guess I would end with a quote from William James, one of the great American philosophers. He said, "The great use of life is to spend it for something that will outlast us." And I believe that that's not just true in our teens and 20s and 30s, but it's true more than ever as we enter this new season of life. So anyway, I apologize for the one long sentence, but I want to know what you think about. It seems like this might be a moment for a call to action for older people, and to reject the idea that we're primarily objects of service and not in a position to contribute and to serve ourselves.
Oh, that's awesome. Wow. Lots to digest, lots. And really forward thinking, especially with JFK, just, I like that. I want to hear from you all. The chat room is got no questions, but before I go to some of the questions that were sent in ahead of time, which were not directly part of Marc's talk today, but if you all have any questions, I'd be happy to share with them. We have 100 people on here. Unfortunately, apparently, Zoom is having problems, and we had 300 registered, and it blocked only 100 and stopped letting people into our Zoom room. We're gonna have to figure that out. So Marc, you weren't the only one that had technical difficulties. I think Zoom is overloaded at this point. So questions, anyone? if you want to, raise your hand or, ask a question of Mark, especially, the ideas around purposefulness and, a national service. Well, I mean, we're already doing a national service for elders and our villages, it's not just volunteers, it's members helping members and neighbors helping neighbors. So I'd like to open it up and see if anybody has a question. Anyone?
Mark, I wonder if you know of any other virtual types of programs we could start getting involved in now with our members, like the Eldera you mentioned. Do you know anything, any other kind of programs like that?
I'm encouraged that some of the traditional platforms for service like Volunteer Match and AARP's Create the Good have really adapted well to the virtual environment that we're all living in. And so I feel like those are two widespread national vehicles that people can use. I've been really interested in some of the innovations that have been developed that are focused on connecting grandparents and grandkids. We gave a prize to one called Caribou that's based in South Florida, but it's national. And then there's one from Barcelona that some of you have probably read about called Together. But I wonder how some of these vehicles like Caribou and Together could be adapted to friends, families, and neighbors too. So for those of us who want to do more beyond what we're doing with our own grandkids, or who don't have grandkids, or for one reason or another aren't able to. So I'd like to see more, and that's what I liked about Eldera. One of the interesting things is a lot of these new efforts that are being formed are created by young people, and they're created by young people who really care about older people. So it's very heartening. Who, in many cases, almost every story I've heard, they had a close relationship with their own, or have a close relationship with their own grandparent, and that's inspired them to try to make it more possible for other people to connect. And I feel like in a lot of ways, this is an extension of the grandparent relationship, which is one of the most, obviously we all know, one of the most beautiful relationships in society. In fact, some people think it's the origins of the human race, that in the early hunter-gatherer days of humanity, it was the role that grandmothers played in taking care of young children that enabled both parents to go out and hunt and gather, which enabled babies to stay in this helpless state for a long period of time and grow the big brains that separate humans from all other species. And so these evolutionary anthropologists now, they have something called the grandmother hypothesis, which argues that it's the role of grandmothers that created human beings in the first place. And so how do we adapt the grandmother hypothesis, the grandfather hypothesis, to the modern family world, and do it at a time when we're living virtually, or living in physically distanced ways?
I love that. We have a couple of questions, but I have to make a comment, Mark, because I am a grandmother. And my son sent me an email the other day, and it was a quote that somebody got off of Facebook, and it went along the lines of, "I'm done babysitting your grandchildren. Can you come and get them?" And, I know that we play a role. I look at the value. I look at my own parents and the unbelievable bond they had with my children, and instilling not just their sense and what they went through back in the Depression and, wars, but the value of love, family, commitment, learning, giving back, all of it. And I think we can teach, our next generations or our grandchildren that. So a couple of questions. Lori Welsh asked if, how do you see this idea unfolding? Do you think local pilots, a national corps? I know that, the Administration on Community Living is looking for a national corps, and this is what that whole community care corps is all about. But do you see a pilot starting more on the local level?
I do. I think states could be really interesting. We've been working with the state of California, which has a chief state service officer who's extremely dynamic. And then they have two master plans that are being created, one around aging and one around early childhood education. They were originally both supposed to come out in October. And before the pandemic hit, our hope was to get this idea of a legacy core, engaging older people in these grandparent-like ways, particularly in the preschool years, in both master plans, and the chief state service officer has shown a lot of interest. And the idea would be to pilot a statewide core of older people, showing what they could do to help support young children. And that is in a state of abeyance, but we're hoping to create the world's first statewide virtual intergenerational service corps in California that could be a model for other states as well. I don't know whether we'll end up being able to pull it off, but I think there's a lot of promise at the state level as well as at the local level. One thing that we've done at Encore is we've launched a new one-year fellowship for social entrepreneurs and innovators who are working to bring the generations together in the post-COVID world. So both during the pandemic and beyond as well, and to really tackle that issue of age segregation that I talked about when I was in Chicago. So I feel like, to go back to the mother of invention idea, that it's not too soon to think about not just what we can do virtually, but as we move beyond this, how we can build face-to-face contact in.
That's awesome. Kathleen asks, do you think there are cultural attributes about aging here in the U.S. that represent something of a barrier to your proposals that don't exist in some of the other cultures, say like Spain, Italy, Japan?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. Going back to one of the earlier questions, I've been following, again, before all this hit, this movement all around the world to create community grandparent roles. And in a lot of them, so one of the biggest efforts is of all places in Finland, because it turns out even in a country the size of Finland, so much smaller than the United States, very frequently grandparents and grandchildren don't live in the same geography. And so they're trying to create these community grandparent roles between older people who are being in grandparent-like roles with unrelated children. So I think it's interesting that this is an issue all over the world. But I feel really concerned about. I felt like over the last decades, and the village to village movement has really played a key role here, that we've been changing attitudes towards older people, recognizing the genuine needs of older people, but at the same time realizing this great contribution that we have to make. I keep going back to the Ethel Percy Andrus, who was the founder of AARP, who was a retired high school principal. Her motto for AARP when it was started was to serve, not to be served. And I think that's a little extreme. I think to serve and to be served is more realistic, but I feel like the to serve part has really been damaged by the pandemic, and older people are being written off. And it's not just in these statements like the Lieutenant Governor of Texas, who talked about older people as essentially being expendable. I really do feel like a lot of the progress has been upended, and I think there's a lot we can do to remind people that we want to keep contributing. We have a lot to contribute. We want to help in ways that that require human experience and talent. And so I am feeling like culturally we've taken a real hit. I don't know if other
Actually,
people are feeling that as well.
we had somebody who wrote in, Lisa, who I think is on the call from At Home in Wilton. She, along the same line, with everything going on now, how do elders go from vulnerable to viable when everyone now thinks that they are at more risk in our society? And you touched, I mean, that's exactly what you're saying. So.
And I think one of the things I want to say, and I say this personally, you know, again, as somebody who, from an age perspective, and also from, you know, having diabetes, you know, considered in an at-risk group, it's that we're both vulnerable and viable at the same time. You know, that those two things are oftentimes connected. But I think there's a tendency to forget the viable part. And I think, you know, in some ways, one of the potential benefits of all of this virtual reality that we're facing these days is forcing so many people to get more sophisticated at doing things like Zoom, and I think it may provide opportunities for people who might not have been able to do face-to-face work in the past to contribute. So I think that there could be some silver lining in all of this.
Awesome. Let me get one from the chat room. I like this one because I'm a political person by nature, culture. It's from Maggie. She says, I'm especially interested in encouraging younger generations to participate in voting. I live in an apartment building with 25 to 35-year-olds, and they are extremely mobile, difficult to connect. And I think an extension of this is how to get them, the younger generation, to commit to knowing that this is their future, they're deciding. And I think it's the older generation that's teaching them and can continue to teach and show the way that you have it in your hands to navigate. How do we do that? How do we reach the ones that don't go out and vote? They don't, you know, oh, no, I'm not, you know, because we know what the outcome is going to be. So why should I vote?
Yeah, you know, and I think that there's this misconception that older people only care about the present, that they don't care about the future. And, you know, probably you've all seen those bumper stickers that say, I'm spending my children's inheritance. Apparently in Canada, there's been this growth of ski clubs, SKI, spending kids' inheritance. And, you know, and I'm sure that there's, you know, some segment of the population believes that, but, you know, as any grandparent knows, we're deeply connected to the future. That there's the Greek proverb that I'm very fond of: society grows great when older people plant trees under whose shade they shall never sit. And I in fact, Atul Gawande, in his brilliant book a few years ago, talked about research that that shows that you know, if people feel like the earth is going to end 5 minutes after their death, it's extraordinarily depressing. You know, we're a species that lives from generation to generation, and so I've been really heartened by groups of older and younger people who are coming together with us, a stake in the future. One of my favorite stories, I think I told the story when we were in Chicago, is from Nuns and Nuns, NUNS and NONES, which is a group that started with some young people out of Harvard Divinity School, millennials who wanted to dedicate their lives to service and to creating a better world, particularly fighting poverty, who started seeking out older sisters, older women religious who had done that over the course of their lives. And they started meetups in a couple dozen cities of these nuns and nuns. And the reason the young people get the NONES label is because when they fill out surveys from places like Pew Research and it asks for religious affiliation, they say they're spiritually inclined, but they have no formal religious affiliation. So they end up being classified as nuns, N-O-N-E-S. And so these nuns and the N-U-N-S is the older sisters. In many cases, their orders are shrinking or dying out, and they're more interested in the work living on than the particular form. And so these beautiful cross-age friendships have developed, and their newest project, I don't know if this is going to continue because of the pandemic, but it was to do voter registration and turnout around the country. And I think there's something very powerful about older and younger people coming together to do that.
I'm going to take a question. So Helen Dennis had sent in one. I don't know if she's on the line. She's a columnist with Aging and the New Retirement. She asked, what do you anticipate as the impact of the pandemic on retirement as we know it?
I feel like in general, the economic toll is going to be absolutely enormous, and I really worry what's going to happen to so many of us whose retirement savings has been hit hard. And I feel like we're going to be in a position where we're not only going to have to live more frugally, but as Helen has been a long advocate for, to work longer. But I worry how we're going to be able to do that without more help. It's one thing to say people should work longer. It's another to actually help make that possible. I'm really keen on this one big policy idea, which in the context of trillion-dollar initiatives, I don't even think would cost much money at all, which is the idea of people being able to take an early year of Social Security to go back to school or to do an internship in return for working an actuarially adjusted period later before getting their full benefits. So it would be cost neutral, and it would be kind of a GI Bill for older people. And by giving people some money to spend on education or skill development, it would also, I think, change higher education just like the GI Bill did, and make them much more interested and receptive to having older people come back to school for a period. And I wrote a paper with Deb Whitman, who's the head of public policy at AARP 2 years ago, laying out what this idea might look like. And I don't think it's a panacea or the answer, but I think we need to be doing a lot more, especially in the context of this economic situation, and helping people to retool for longer working lives.
Awesome. So several people have touched on Rachel and Richard. They've talked about, their villages are actually interactive with, some of the elementary schools, partnering with the elementary schools, and looking for other ideas. Would love to connect. They were, like Rachel had said, that they're hoping to add. I'm sorry, I'm backing up. They're playing cribbage in school, partnering with local elementary schools, participating, volunteering regularly with 4th grade math classes, and to teach and play cribbage, which is great. We're hoping to do other similar programs with older adults through play or other school subjects. And I want to add, Zoom at this point, because we have, I have nephews who are, who knows what's going to happen in the fall as far as schools and how we can do this. Any other ideas of games or activities that we can do?
Yeah, one of my favorite stories from a couple of years ago was this friendship that happened between this young African-American rapper from New York and an older woman living in a retirement community in Florida, who met through playing words with friends.
I saw that story, yeah.
Yeah, it was in the New York Times and the Washington Post and went viral. And then Reverend Amy Butler, who's the pastor of the Riverside Church in New York, where this young man arranged a face-to-face get-together between the two of them, and it was, very heartwarming. But I think that there are a lot of things around. You mentioned cribbage, around games that can be a basis for friendship. I came away feeling like the keys to intergenerational friendship were proximity and purpose and shared purpose. Proximity, whether it's physical or whether it's virtual, a chance to connect, but also some common interest. And rather than putting people together and saying, you should relate, I saw in Experience Corps all the time the way tutoring became a kind of crucible around which a close relationship, grandparent-like relationship could form. And so I think that one of the advantages of platforms like Caribou is that they provide a lot of those tools, so you don't have to come up with them yourself. So I think it would be great if we could make that easier. And then I guess one other broader thought that I was prompted by some of the earlier questions is that I feel like, all this local work and having a lot of variation is incredibly important, and that should be central. But it would be great if we could marry that to some kind of broader sense of purpose, connection, and identity. And I think of the Peace Corps. People do lots of different things in the Peace Corps. They do it in lots of different countries, but they have this sense that they're Peace Corps alums, and there's a sense of kindred spirit and the idea that they're working, in an overall way towards a goal. And I would love it if we could find a way to combine this sense of, call to action to our generation, some way of saying that we're all in this together, that the whole is bigger than the parts. But also lots of ways in which we can, at the local level, achieve this goal. But, maybe if the goal is helping kids read by the 3rd grade, but there are many, many different ways to do that at the local level, but we're all part of a collective enterprise where, we're able to accomplish something more together than what we would do in myriad individual ways. So maybe I'm out of touch with that idea, but I feel like when I talk to people who've been in the Peace Corps, I do feel that kind of sense that they were part of something larger.
Well, and I agree. I have a question. It's interesting. Jack Cumming, who asked, and I think it makes me go back and reflect my own, family. Mark, was there an elder in your parents' generation that you looked up to as a mentor?
It's funny. I had this script, which was true. When I talked about how I ended up in this kind of work, and which is that I spent the first 15 years of my working life focused on mentoring for kids, and was involved in the first study of Big Brothers Big Sisters that had been done in 100 years and showed the impact that Big Brothers and Big Sisters were having on kids' lives. But I got interested in older people because at the time we did the study, there were half as many kids on the waiting list for Big Brothers Big Sisters that were actually being served. And it raised this question of where, if these kinds of bonds matter so much, where are the human beings to do the things that only people can do? And even then, a quarter century ago, I felt like the answer was older people. But that's not the true answer. And the real answer is exactly that question. Is I've just had throughout my whole life the string of older people who have taken me under wing and just made an enormous difference. And it started when I was in college, and I went to college at a time when it was much easier to get into college than young people today face. But when I arrived at college, I realized I was completely unprepared. And in fact, I got 9 incompletes in my first 2 years, which is, I think, still the Mid-Atlantic record for procrastination and being unable to finish anything off. And it turns out at the college that I went to, you had to, in order to get an incomplete, you had to ask the professor and you had to fill out a form, but then they made you see this wizened older dean, a guy by the name of Gil Stott. And went to see him so much to get these incompletes that he became like a surrogate grandparent. And it was a beautiful relationship. And I felt that he was always more interested in me as a person than as the requester of incompletes. And he made me feel at home. And then later I started with Encore with John Gardner, who was a remarkable man who he passed away. He won the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1964. And by the way, one of the most incredible classes, of people win the Presidential Medal of Freedom. I went back and looked at who else won it in 1964. It was Helen Keller, Walt Disney, T.S. Eliot, John Steinbeck, Tom Watson, the founder of IBM. It was quite a testimony to what people in this country have accomplished. But so John then went on from winning the Presidential Medal of Freedom to doing all of his most important work in the second half of life. He was Lyndon Johnson's architect of the Great Society. He founded Common Cause. And he, when he passed away, I went to his memorial service, and on the program was he was the person who implemented Medicare and the Older Americans Act when he was HEW secretary. And on it was this quote from John during the battles over Medicare. And it said, "America today faces breathtaking opportunities disguised as unsolvable problems." And in the midst of everything that we're going on now, I think a lot about the quote about John, who was a practical optimist, if there ever was one. And those words seem more on target than they even did when I first read them.
I love it. One question, I know we're winding down, is from Marianne Probst. And she said, I think all of us could use some practical steps or tools that villages can take to get our members more involved with the younger generations. We need to overcome some of the significant barriers to this happening in our community. And ideas or a list of resources would always be welcome. And if you don't want to rattle it off now, send it to me and I'll share it or whatever later with, as we are recording this so we can send it out to everybody.
Yeah, well, first of all, it's great because Marianne's the person front and center on my gallery view screen. When other people have asked questions, I've had to, it's like the world's biggest game of Hollywood squares. And so we've been compiling that list, and I will be able to send it right afterwards to Barbara, because I feel like as much as we need a whole new wave of vehicles to be involved, there are things that we can do right now. And so we've been trying to create essentially a clearinghouse for that, and happy to share it.
That'd be great, because one of the questions and comments, not necessarily a question, was from Judith. And we have to remember that, a lot of our elders don't have access to technology. And that virtual connection is hard. And I know many of our villages are trying to teach Zoom. We can see we've been working with Zoom for a couple of years, and you can see the glitches that happen with Zoom and technology. But, I go back to, what, Judith said, we have to think of ways to include everybody and to be inclusive. And I don't know if this list incorporates it. I did see that article about with Words with Friends, which I play, and it's kind of fun. I have no idea who I'm playing with, but that's the fun part about it. But I think it's a great intergenerational thing if you can get somebody connected.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I know, since we're coming to the end of the time, I just want to say that I'm an unabashed, undying fan of the village movement, and I'm practically, wandering the streets of San Francisco with a village sandwich board accosting strangers. And when I had the chance to go on that book tour last year, the highlights were all through getting a chance to come to Village. That started on a snowy Chicago night in January with the Chicago Village, where I thought, 3 people were going to show up, and instead 400 did. And it ended visiting Helen Dennis and in Palos Verdes and getting a chance to be at the Village there. And I think the reason first of all, I appreciate your indulgence of not, just sitting back and getting the stump speech, but I just really, this is really what's on my mind. And I wanted to throw it out to you because to my mind, there's been no more spectacular innovation in the aging realm than the Village idea. And so I feel like if anybody is going to come up with ways we can do something in this realm, it's all of you, because you've already broken the mold. But I'd like to be part of a movement of older people who are looking out for the next generation, our own grandkids, but beyond that realm into the community.
I love that. That's awesome. And I love having you here, Mark. You are an inspiration, and we do love your support, really and truly. What's nice is, and I hear it across the board, that villages, somebody asked me, well, how many villages closed during this time period? I'm like, none. They're thriving because you know what? We started as grassroots. We know how to go back to the base. And that's the encouraging part about the Village movement. So thank you all for what you're doing and how you're doing it. And we will stay the course and stay safe and stay well. And
Thanks.
Stay connected. Thank you all.
Take care.
Thank you for doing
Thanks,
this.
Mark.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Outstanding.